The original sin is that you attacked Iran without any reason or excuse, and if indeed as a result of the initial attack by the Israelis and the entry of the United States into the conflict, culminating into the sanctions and the blockades, situation has become desperate. As the saying goes, desperate times call for desperate action. And I think this is how I understand the manner in which Tehran has reacted. They are saying, if you are a friend of the United States in the region, then you are our enemy. If you have a base of the United States in Qatar, it is being used against us. If you have a base in Bahrain, it is being used against us. If you have a base in Jordan or in Saudi Arabia, it is being used against us. And I believe that behind the scenes, they are now telling their allies, you are friends. And a friend in need is a friend indeed. And the Houthis have come out. Hezbollah has come out to respond and to help their friend in need. You know, when one talks about what is now characterized as the Iran, American, and Israeli war, one can never be too certain about what is going to happen. Many a commentator thought that this issue had been resolved with the Omani intervention. One thought that the Qatari intervention would resolve the problem. One thought that the Pakistani intervention would resolve the problem. But it appears that it is easier said than done. And one must understand this particular conflict in context. That initially it started as a war between Iran and Israel. And it's the Israelis who, in their first volleys of attack in the month of February, thought that they had decapitated the leadership of Iran, leading to the death of the supreme leader Khamenei. And they thought that that would be the end of it. But it did not end. So that when the Americans came, the Israelis, from where I sit, succeeded in persuading them that we ought to ensure that Iran does not have a nuclear capability. So that was the reason why the Americans came in and bombed some of the sites. And their president even went public and said, we have now ensured that Iran will never have nuclear capability. But that has now changed. It has changed in different ways. It has changed, number one, from the perspective of the Americans. The Americans now find themselves embroiled in a war which they thought would be prosecuted very quickly and is now taking a very different turn. And the turn has now seen the Americans mount a blockade. The Americans have now seen their allies in that part of the world, to mean Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, Qatar, and even Jordan, being hit. And that disruption, in my view, was never quite anticipated by the handlers of President Trump. Secondly, it has also disrupted international maritime activities with the closure of the Strait of Hormuz. And this is a critical strait. The Strait of Hormuz is the pathway for many of the seagoing vessels that go to Asia and indeed to what is described as the Far East. So that is one of the things that the two things that have happened with regard to the Iran, American, and Israeli war. The other perspective is from the perspective of Israel. Israel has always wanted to decimate Iran. Remember that the Iranians have never recognized Israel and have always said that this Zionist entity ought to be dealt with. unless the Palestinian question is resolved. And for a long time, successive U.S. administrations have received entreaties from the Israelis to participate in the war, and they have not until Trump came. The Israelis also accuse the Iranians of being the protectors of the Houthis in Yemen and Hezbollah in Lebanon and even Hamas in Gaza. So to them, the Iranians ought to be eliminated off the face of the earth, which then brings us to attempts at diplomatic resolution. These attempts have taken different formats. The initial one in the recent past was the Omani intervention, and it's during that intervention that the Israelis struck and therefore torpedoed the diplomatic efforts that were being made. The International Atomic Agency was also very active in Iran, and at one time the Iranian nuclear facilities were the most inspected on earth in recent times. And it was quite clear that they had not reached a level of enriching any uranium to a weapons grade. So this argument that has now become the basis of the conflict is one that is debatable. But America now finds itself in a situation where in many ways it is fighting a proxy war for Israel. The Israelis are now busy in Lebanon, they are busy in Gaza, and the Americans have taken over this war, and they don't know how to get out of it. And I think that despite their statements to the contrary, when you listen to President Trump, when you listen to Hesketh, who is in charge of defense or Department of War, when you listen to Mark Rubio, there is a lot of grandstanding. But I think that they don't know how to deal with the situation. That is where their attacks have now migrated to military installations into civilian infrastructure. And they are giving meaning to the early statement of Trump when he said, we are going to bomb Iran into Stone Age. But for what purpose? This is the question that commentators and objective observers are asking. Why do you want to bomb them? If it was because of their nuclear capacity, you said that you had eradicated it. Why do you want to bomb their infrastructure? Why are you blockading them? Why are you interfering with international commerce and international supply chain? And I dare say that perhaps now the Americans have no answer. Perhaps now the Israelis have no answer. And the answer that they may give behind the curtains is, it is now war for war's sake. And we see who wins. It is now a question of whether we will beat them into a state of surrender. But history is consistent. The Iranians are not just about to surrender. You know, there was never a peace agreement. There was a memorandum of understanding whose terms were very clear. There are certain things that the Iranians wanted to be guaranteed. They wanted to be guaranteed that they will have some sovereign right over the Strait of Hormuz. They wanted to be guaranteed that they would not be bombed. They wanted to be guaranteed that they would continue with their research on non-weapon nuclear activities. They wanted to be guaranteed that they would be compensated for the damage that has been occasioned. They wanted to be guaranteed that the sanctions would be lifted. But on the side of the United States of America, as egged on by Israel, they want a surrender. And the Iranians then, in my view, understood this particular memorandum of understanding or peace agreement as a demand that they must surrender. They were also required, as history recent history will tell us, to guarantee that Hezbollah will be disarmed in Lebanon. So this particular memorandum or peace treaty, if you may, was dead on arrival. Indeed, no sooner had the ink dried on it than the Iranians were accused of going against some of the agreements, and that justified the behavior of the United States of America. So the Strait of Hormuz, as we know it, many did not know, but it's a very critical pathway for many sea-going vessels because it shortens the journey, particularly from Europe and Asia. Because if you are moving from Europe, then you go through the Mediterranean Sea and through the Suez Canal and into the Strait of Hormuz. And if you are going down further, Bab el-Mandab is a little lower down, and it passes through the Arabian Sea and Yemen and brings you into the Indian Ocean. And that is a large supply chain and supply line for deliveries to Eastern Africa, to parts of India, and even down if you want to go to other parts in the southern hemisphere. That is the path that you follow. It shortens your journey by several thousand kilometers. If you disrupt activities in that area, what are the routes that are available to you? If you are from Asia, you now have to go down the Cape of Good Hope and do the coast of Angola and Namibia through to the West African coast, through to Dakar, through to Banjul, and then into Spain and Portugal. The cost and the time that is taken, the insurance cost that is involved, and all the other implications. And remember that you are not just talking about those obvious costs. You are now talking about piracy, which is beginning to rear its ugly head once again along the coast of Somalia. You are talking about the cost of the involvement of pirates again, even in areas such as Mozambique and even on the western coast. So these are very critical areas in international maritime trade. And that is why they ought to be guarded. Remember when the Suez Canal was opened in those early years, there was great celebration because it shortened your journey by more than half. And this is being felt throughout the world. It is felt in terms of the cost of fuel. It is felt in terms of the entire supply chain, in terms of timely delivery of the requirements that are needed to oil the international economy. And I believe that when economists are doing their survey in the not too distant future, they'll be able to say that the economy of the world has been affected in a big way. And that is something that could have been avoided. You know, the Houthis work very closely, as we already know, with the Iranians. And I think there is sufficient evidence that even their decision not to participate in this particular conflict in the early days was because the Iranians told them, please don't participate. But beyond that, there is a contestation between the so-called legitimate government of Yemen, which operates out of Sana'a, and the Houthis. And this is why the Houthis have been involved in a conflict with the Saudis, who have been supporting the Sana'a administration. So the Houthis are now getting involved in this particular conflict because their big brother or sister, if you may, in Iran is being bombarded by the United States of America and by Israel. And their other allies are also being bombarded by, in Lebanon, the Hezbollah. And of course, Hamas is also being bombarded in Gaza and the West Bank. So it is a coalition of people who are ideologically aligned. Hamas, Houthis, Hezbollah, and their regional supporter and backer, which is Tehran administration. And therefore they are coming into this conflict to lend support to the Iranians. You know, it is very easy to accuse Iran, particularly from Western commentators who want to cast Iran in a very negative way. But let us go back to the beginning. The beginning was that the Israelis were fighting Hamas in Gaza. And then the Israelis, without any reason whatsoever, suddenly decided to attack Tehran and to eliminate its leadership. If there was any reason or argument, that reason or argument is not self-evident, because at that time, as we know, there were ongoing negotiations. At that time, the Iranians were cooperating with the International Atomic Energy, and they were allowing their facilities to be inspected. So the question is, why did you do what you did? Because that was the original sin. The original sin is that you attacked Iran without any reason or excuse. And if indeed, as a result of the initial attack by the Israelis and the entry of the United States into the conflict, culminating into the sanctions and the blockades, situation has become desperate. As the saying goes, desperate times call for desperate action. And I think this is how I understand the manner in which Tehran has reacted. They are saying, if you are a friend of the United States in the region, then you are our enemy. If you have a base of the United States in Qatar, it is being used against us. If you have a base in Bahrain, it is being used against us. If you have a base in Jordan or in Saudi Arabia, it is being used against us. And I believe that behind the scenes, they are now telling their allies, you are friends. And a friend in need is a friend indeed. And the Houthis have come out. Hezbollah has come out to respond and to help their friend in need. When one looks at the Iran-American-Israeli war, one can very quickly recognize that this, on the part of America, was meant to bring in its NATO allies. Of course, the NATO allies have not come in the manner that the Americans wanted them to. Indeed, this is why he's gotten some very unkind words towards Italy and Spain particularly, who are very clear that this is not our war to fight. On the other side, the Russians and the Chinese also see Iran as a useful ally who is dependable in that region, which the Americans through Israel want to hegemonize. They are not as loud as the Americans are, but I believe that the Chinese, if one studies their diplomacy quietly, are with the Iranians. The Russians are also with the Iranians. And one can never know what happens behind the scenes, but this is also a contestation. It is some kind of a war, a quiet, silent war amongst the superpowers, the economic superpowers. And when I see, for example, the President of the United States of America saying that the Chinese are trying to interfere with the American elections, they want to depict China as this power that is trying to contest with them. And even if they don't say it as loudly as one would have expected, they think that quietly the Chinese are supporting the Iranians. Of course, they know that the Russians have had a long relationship with the Iranians, and they have said it, as some of them have said it, that some of the weaponry, including the ballistic missiles and even the drones, are being supplied by the Russians, and if not supplied, the technology that is being used is Russian and Chinese. So this must be seen in that context, that there is some kind of scramble. And in that scramble, the only obvious people that the Americans and the Israelis see as their enemies are the Russians and the Chinese. But remember that Chinese diplomacy is normally silent, it is quiet, it is subterranean, and is not scrutable. It is very difficult to discern. Conversely, Russia is also not very loud, because the Russians are also involved in their own conflict with the Ukrainians. Linking the conflict between Russia and Ukraine and the conflict involving the Iranians, the United States, and Israel can be considered very tenuous, but even in that sense, a number of things emerge. One, that the day the Americans entered the war in Iran, they lost the moral authority to criticize Russia for invading Ukraine. And they can say many things, and occasionally their president says things. We are going to midwife a meeting between President Zelensky and President Putin. On another day, he says the Russians want to end the war, the Ukrainians want to end the war. And I think that is informed by the reality that he or she who has a speck on his eye is limited and cannot point out the log on the other person's eye. But it is important also to understand the Russian-Ukrainian war in terms of the NATO alliance. It is quite obvious to anybody who is looking at the situation that Ukraine is now also prosecuting a proxy war. And if one ever doubted that, you can see the alacrity with which European powers, the Brussels administration of the EU, and a number of European powers are quick to want to fast track the entry of Ukraine into the European Union and even into the NATO alliance. And this may be overthinking, but perhaps this is also a theater for the NATO powers to kind of experiment with some of their weaponry. The Ukrainians are on record as saying that this war has taught us how to make drones and how to make them more efficient. So because Europe and America and some of their thinkers are anticipating a bigger war in the near future, this could be a practice ground, which is very sad, because I have always held the view that if this particular conflict was left to the Ukrainians and the Russians, it would have ended. But because the interests are out there who are manipulating, and particularly manipulating the Ukrainians and assuring them that we are behind you, their appetite for escalating this war is not diminishing. And one can see the emerging contradictions even within Ukraine, with the firing of the Minister for Defense and the head of the army. It tells you that there is pulling and pushing within the Ukrainian political arena. What impact it will have on the war is one for which the jury is still out. On the 20th day of July, the President of the United States is on record as saying that the Americans actually support the war in Iran. which means he is beginning to create the impression that the war in Iran will have very limited impact on the election, the midterm elections, which it was argued, particularly by the Democrats, would be won by them because the war was unpopular. But remember that Americans are now beginning to receive dead bodies. 18 and counting. And this is stretching it too far. But this is how the domestic resentment for the war in Vietnam started. When body bags begin to arrive in the United States of America, then public opinion begins to change and people begin to ask, why are we spending so much money? Why are we spending billions? Already 37 billion has been expended in the war in Iran. The average figure is that 1 billion United States dollars is being spent to prosecute the war in Iran. And in addition to that, the cost of certain commodities are beginning to rise, so that households are beginning to relate and associate their plight with the war in Iran. That, I think, is something that is going to make people say we must end this war. Whether that is going to happen as quickly as the world desires is another debate. One would have thought, for example, at this time, that the United States would have gone through the United Nations to call for some urgent meeting, and if not the United States, the United Nations of its own motion would have moved to broker peace. But this is not happening. But in international matters, one day is a long time, and many things can happen, particularly if the ground changes. And I think one of the things that is going to ensure that peace is sought is the situation in the Middle East. And this is what brings me back to the significance of the Strait of Hormuz and Bandar el-Mandab, and also brings me to the situation in Kuwait, because they are now being hit in Kuwait, the situation in Bahrain, the situation in Saudi, the situation in Jordan. Those American allies in that area are the ones who now are saying, this is disrupting our economies. This is disrupting air travel in this region. This is beginning to impact us. And I am of the view that they are going to push the United States of America to enter into some settlement. As for Israel, it is another debate. I think, and this is something that we repeat ad nauseum, Israel is now a war economy. And in my view, the administration of Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu only knows how to survive in a war environment. And as we speak now, they are already having verbal exchanges, even with Pakistan. So that tells you that they want this war to continue. And if they were left to their own designs, I wouldn't be surprised if the Israelis were even to drop a nuclear device on Iran. But I believe they'll be restrained from doing so. That is the unfortunate scenario. One only hopes that diplomacy and mediation will carry the day. You know, from where I sit, in the early days of the war, it was a restricted war. The targets were military installations. But in the recent past, we have now seen drones that are targeting facilities that have implication on civilian lifestyles. And I think if the Russians were thinking of this war as a remote war, people are beginning to say, but it's affecting us. If you hit a gas station or an oil refinery, or you hit something that produces things that we use on a daily basis, then it does two things. The first thing it does is, in the minds of some, let us end this war. Let us end this war so that we can go back to our normal lives, so that we can continue trade, so that we can travel. But there is another group that may be saying, well, now that they are beginning to hit us where it hurts, let us destroy them completely. So I believe that in Russia there may be these two factions. The faction that says they have hit us where it hurts most, therefore let us hit them even harder. And then there is the faction that is saying, no, let us restrain ourselves. We are being drawn into a battle which we thought would be a swift intervention, and is now several years down the line. Let us bring it to an end. Which then begs the question, what does the Putin administration think of all these, and how does the Putin administration react? Are they responding to the group that are saying we ought to end this war, or responding to the group that says we ought to end this war by engaging in debilitation of the Ukrainians? And it is the question now of political wisdom and decision making. How do you want to be remembered in history? Do you want to be remembered as a president who took his country to a war that never ended? Are we doing what the Americans did in Vietnam? Do we want a replay of what happened in Afghanistan? And one hopes that wisdom will prevail. The other thing that President Putin must ask himself, is this a bait by the NATO alliance to get him deeper and deeper into this war, and to enable and to justify the continuation of this war of attrition which is being prosecuted through Ukraine? This is a very important time for Russian politicians led by President Putin, and one hopes that they'll make the decision that is in the best interest of Russia. And from where some of us sit, that decision is to end this war. Because if indeed the war was prosecuted in the first place because we were going back, that NATO would not move to the east, I think Ukraine's appetite to join NATO and to join EU has now been sharpened, and that they would now want to join EU and NATO regardless. So the question is, have we achieved what we intended to achieve? Have we earned what we intended to earn? Difficult questions. Armchair theorists can answer them very quickly, but those on the hot seat may not have obvious answers. You know, China has now consolidated her position as the second largest economy in the world, and there are very many areas in which China is now the leader. If you go into the chip manufacturing, is now the obvious leader. If you go into energy production, 3 million megawatts of electricity. If you go into the electric vehicles, is the leader. And I think China now wants to have a dominant presence in the China Sea and Southeast Asia. And if one were to look at how it plays its politics in the ASEAN area, it wants to ensure that nobody is singing another tune other than the Chinese tune. If there is a conflict involving the islands with the Philippines, and they want therefore Taiwan to play ball. And there is evidence to demonstrate that there are two distinct schools in China and two distinct schools in Taiwan on the question of how they should relate. The first school says that in order to ensure that the renegade province of Taiwan is returned to China, we use force. Then there is the schools that says, no, let us play diplomacy. The reason why we are where we are now economically is because we have avoided conflict. time is on our side. Within Taiwan, there is also a school that says that our long-term health, economically and security-wise, demands that we move closer to China and have a Hong Kong kind of arrangement. But there is another school that says, no, America is our protector. Let us buy more weapons and let's dare the Chinese. Let them come and try to take us over, and the Americans will come in. But the Chinese, I think, are playing the long haul game. And when you listen to them, and the Chinese are not very easy to interpret, but on the occasions that they come out, they say, if push comes to shove, we are going to invade. Is there a timeline? I don't think that a reading of the crystal ball says there is a timeline. But are there signs, and are there things that could energize them? Yes. The Americans have invaded the Iranians. The Russians attacked Ukraine. Why don't we? This is the time when no accusing fingers will be pointed towards us. So I'm sure these are things that can give them the appetite. But reading the Chinese, as I do, not easy to read. When I look at the wars and the conflicts taking place, some of them are hot conflicts in terms of being armed conflicts. But remember that there are also economic wars or trade wars that are happening around the world. You see the conflict and the one-size-fits-all American weapon of tariffs against everybody on site. It is a tariff against Spain, a tariff against Brazil, a tariff against China, a tariff against Spain, tariffs all over. And then you see the emergence of the BRICS, with the Brazilians, the Russians, the Indians, the Chinese, and the South Africans to a certain extent. And you see the conflicts in Haiti, you see the blockade of Cuba, you see what is happening with what happened with the Maduros in Venezuela. You see one common thread, and you see that the institution that was created after the Second World War to ensure that there would be no other war, the United Nations, is becoming weaker and weaker by the day. It tells you that the thing that men learn from history is that they learn nothing from history, because we are repeating the same things. After the League of Nations created after the First World War, then another war, then the Second World War, and we are now saying with our action that there is, at least the Europeans and the Americans appear to have appetite for another war. It is as if war is something that they require to renew something which we do not know. But somebody, I can't remember who, once said, when he was asked, will there be a third world war? He said, yes, it will either be fought with stones or in piecemeal. And one can already begin to see wars in different hemispheres in the world. And it starts with things such as territorial claims. Territorial claims of a historical nature. Look at the World War. The Germans wanted to have Poland. They wanted to have parts of Czechoslovakia, parts of the Czech Republic. And the Soviet Union at that time also wanted parts of Poland. Now the Americans want Greenland. The Chinese want Taiwan. So one sees a repeat of the same. And one hopes that it does not degenerate, because if it does, like it did with Hiroshima and Nagasaki, who knows whether a nuclear device cannot be used. And this time round, it will not just be used in one part of the world. It will be used in different ways with intercontinental ballistic missiles to the detriment of the whole world. When one assesses and analyzes the world, one must reason with the worst and hope for the best. Because, I mean, if you look at some of the wars that have been prosecuted in the world in the recent past, one thought that we had left that particular period. And one would have assumed, for example, when we talked about the sovereignty of nations and equality of nations, who would have thought that one nation would move into another sovereign nation and go into the bedroom of their head of state and take them to their country and subject them to trial, as is happening with Maduro? Nobody would have. Who would have thought that in this day and age, somebody would go, the United States of America, after the missile crisis in the 1960s, would blockade Cuba so that Cuba does not exist as it should? Who would have thought so? Who would have thought that Israel would go into Lebanon and destroy all their bridges? Who would have thought that Israel would go into Gaza and West Bank and do what they did, and the international community is silent? Who would have thought that the Americans would blockade Iran and attack Iran and kill its leaders without any reason? Who would have thought that the crisis that we see in Sudan would be happening and there is no reaction in the international community? Who would have thought that the South Africans would expel fellow Africans? I mean, when you look at all these happenings in the world, it tells you that really there can never be an exact analysis and assessment of the situation in the world. There are too many moving parts, and that even the institutions that we thought would immunize us from these things that we can very well anticipate have become neutered. And you almost always sympathize with the Secretary General of the United Nations when you see him moving around the world, issuing statements which are then honored in breach. These are the sad times in which we live. Who would have thought that the President of the United States of America, which claimed that it had strong institutions, would almost rule by decree and make demands of land belonging to other nations? These are interesting times. These are dangerous times. As was said by an English writer, Charles Dickens, in the book A Tale of Two Cities, the best of times and the worst of times. When I look at what is happening, the more things change, the more they remain the same. And I'm a student of all religion. When I look at Africa, it was war amongst nations, African nations. When I look at Europe, it was the same. When you look at communities and societies, it's conflict. Then we have memorandums of understanding, that we have peace treaties. And when you look even at the Old Testament, which is the Jewish Torah, is all war. When you look at the Hindu Gita, it is war. When you look at the Quran, it is war. And when you look at the recent past, you see the wars that we fought for, whether it's civil war, the wars for independence, when Europe had gone through the agrarian revolution and the industrial revolution. The First World War came, the Third World War came, then we saw what happened in Eastern Europe, then we saw what happened in countries such as Afghanistan, in Vietnam, in Cambodia, in Laos. We saw what happened in the Falkland Islands. We see what is happening in the Middle East. It appears that war is part of our so-called civilization. And therefore, we must brace for war at all times. I mean, this is the time in history when countries possess weapons that can destroy all human beings, I'm told, except cockroaches and geckos. This is man's inhumanity to man. And we are on a daily basis in the countries that we know engaging in research of finding out how quickly we can kill each other, whether through the nuclear weapons or through biological weapons. This is the nature of man. That's what we call civilization. How can we kill each other very quickly? It is a sad scenario, and it begs the question, what does the word civilization actually mean?